Bryan, at Distributech, you led an excellent roundtable session on the benefits and risks of AI in the energy industry. What were your key takeaways?
Ooh, there's a lot of key takeaways. Really interesting session. I think the first one is the level of interest in artificial intelligence. We've been, I've been personally talking to utility companies over the last year, and almost all of those conversations have skewed towards artificial intelligence, particularly in the area of Gen AI. And that was mirrored in what we saw at this particular session. It was supposed to be, maximum 40 people within a room. We got hundreds of registrations. We filled up the seats and then let in another 30 people to stand around the outside and turned the whole group away. And it's really indicative of what we're seeing in the industry, where it's this advance in generative AI. It's not just applicable to generative AI; it's applicable to all of artificial intelligence. And we've seen just the level of interest go through the roof, and that's reflected in just the turnout that we saw in the session. Once we got in there, then it's the variety of use cases that we saw people coming up with, the number of people who are starting to experiment with the technology. And what I was comforted to see was that there's a healthy level of, I'll call it fear within the room, but really it's a respect of the technology and thinking through now, how do we not just use artificial intelligence, but use it in a responsible way that's going to allow us to get those material benefits without risking what's essentially critical infrastructure in a highly regulated industry.
Now, as you said, the level of interest, yeah, I had to probably to say plumb off my way, as we would say, because I was a few minutes late. But it was certainly a very interactive session. As you say, the level of interest, but also I suppose the varying levels of interest. Some people were just starting out. Some people were far more advanced. Any particular use cases that you hadn't come across that jumped out at you?
There weren't any that I hadn't seen before. And I thought what was interesting is there was a mix of people who were discussing some of the more traditional artificial intelligence, things like computer vision for asset management or wildfire, or using technology within the call center through chatbots or agent assist type mechanisms. And it was really comforting to hear that people were starting to move forward in some of these, I'll call them lower hanging fruit areas. So those were really interesting ones that I saw come out of the session.
Now, you mentioned, the respect. What I found fascinating just listening to the discussion was a lot of people, as you say, like we really got to try and get our heads around that. But making the comment that, look, you also need to understand that an AI is a very different decision-making process than us humans. And if you don't get your head around that, then it can lead to trouble. How did you find that comment?
What I really was encouraged by was the number of people that were talking about responsibility and putting guardrails in place in order to leverage artificial intelligence. However, when we started discussing how, I think there's a gap between effective ways to execute and the stage that a lot of us are in right now. A lot of the conversations were around, I'll put an instance within my own private enterprise. Or it might be about, I'll use training so that people understand, the results that are coming through and, try and ensure that we can put a human to double check the results. But where we seem to have a gap is when we were talking about how we actually put an architecture in place, where instead of just trusting on people through training or that type of exercise, how do we understand the data source of where these foundation models are being trained? And so on one hand, we're saying, yes, we need to be responsible, but then we close our eyes and we just, assume everything's going to be fine with some of the models that are available. Or we go down the training path without thinking about how do we codify governance? How do we have programs in place to detect bias, to detect drift? So I think the intention there is now where people are thinking about it, but I think we're a little bit limited in how we go about implementing this in a way that's going to allow us to really, really take advantage of the technology.
One topic that was briefly discussed, if I may, was around the sharing of their own data to help other people build their language models. Is that something you're seeing people talking about, or is it, I'll take data from someone else, but I'm keeping my own?
There's a natural tendency to do so. And there's questions about, regulatory questions, right? Is this type of data, protected through programs like NERC-CIP, and can I actually make that available? I will say we're very much involved in some very advanced use cases around sharing data across multiple participants, and that's something we could talk about at a later time. But absolutely, and I think something you brought up is really important. The low-hanging fruit that we're starting with, we'll call it that. The risk level is somewhat lower. So when we start thinking about governance, if we start thinking about how we start putting guardrails in place, some of the things we need to do, and this came up in the session, is start thinking about what is the use case, what's the risk level, and can I apply current technology with current governance in order to solve that problem? Really, really critical. As we start getting towards things like running the grid, now we have a whole nother set of risk and a whole nother set of rigor that has to go into what we do. And so using some of these early use cases as a way to understand and learn how to govern, how to build explainability, how to build monitoring for bias and drift, how to build protection for data security. Those are the foundational blocks that are going to let us use it for those more advanced use cases where we do have more risk. So it's a really important time. And I think what I'm starting to see is that people aren't just deploying a use case to see if we can use this AI technology. It's how do we do it in a way that lets me build that architecture? So now I can take advantage of it in more ways.
It's not kind of we do it in silos. It's kind of how do we do it across the entire company, and obviously that adds a bit more complexity. But people are starting to get their heads around this.
Starting to, and there's still a lot of playing at the individual use case level, but starting to get that perspective about, okay, how do I actually do this in a safe way that goes beyond, just training or trust within my employees into actually codifying into my processes and architecture?
Well, certainly what was quite promising to see was the willingness of people to share what they were doing, what worked, what didn't. And I know there was a lot of conversations going on afterwards between people going, how do you do that? And we did that and whatever. So I think we'll see a lot more of that, hopefully. And I think one of the key themes coming out of Distributech was AI is a team sport, right? So it wasn't just partnerships and the usual kind of marketing. It was like, we need to work on this stuff together.
And I think the industry is recognizing this and working very much towards that. And the other thing I saw was interesting was approaches, not just around the governance side, which is critical, but are we getting better results out of artificial intelligence? So doing things like A/B testing, right? Where I'll get half my team using traditional methods and half using the results from AI. And let's see if we're actually getting the benefits and results that we hope that we get. So a lot of that learning can be shared amongst the industry.
Now, as you say, you've been chatting with many folks across the industry, across the globe in the past 12 months. Any surprise? Anything that caught you unawares?
The one thing that surprised me in the last year is how senior the focus is. Getting meetings with CEOs is fairly common to have discussions around artificial intelligence. Having the CEO sponsor their entire leadership team to be involved in those conversations and planning moving forward. And the reason I find that surprising is, with traditional AI, we can build something, but you tend to struggle getting executive sponsorship. Now we've got the attention of the C-suite. They're mandating that their teams learn about AI and think about its use within the business to build into automation, to build into mechanisms to run their business better. And that gives us an opportunity now. And it's a window to start thinking about how do we get the appropriate data governance processes in place? How do we get the model governance components in place to manage the AI? The things that we've been trying to do for 20 years, but struggling because we don't have that level of support. We have that level of support now. And it's not just the utility companies, it's the regulators as well. I'm speaking with many of them who are looking at policies to encourage the use of AI, but also thinking through, do I need to put any more regulations in place for its use? So fascinating time right now.
Now, Bryan, as we saw in the room, the level of maturity around use of AI, Gen AI, it varies. So given your role, how do you approach that with different customers? Because they're all different.
And that's completely consistent with what we're seeing, speaking to clients around the globe. Usually the meetings start off, even if they do have a background in AI, they want to know more. So there's an education component. So you've got to feel it a little bit about how much they know. And even in companies that are sophisticated, there'll be a few who understand it and a bunch of others who may have heard of or used generative AI or a chatbot, but don't really understand the concepts. So it usually starts with that education level. And from there, we start to dive into what the technology is actually good for. And we give some really solid examples about places where we can leverage this type of new AI technology to get results really, really quickly. And we've got a set of use cases that we often talk to clients about in areas like, traditional back office in human resources or IT service desk. We talk about areas around customer care, either doing a website with a chatbot or call deflection through a call center or an agent assist for the call center agents to be able to have AI listen in on the call, understand what the customer is asking for, and bring data to the agent before they even need to look it up. Right. So those are some of the cases we're seeing. We're seeing a lot within, I'll say, the field service area, where we've got field workers who need access to standard operating procedures, who need access to manuals and past service history. So now we give them the ability to get access to that information in a much more effective way. We also look at things like regulatory processes, which we see with a lot of our clients, saying, how do I understand the changes that are coming? How do I actually use this technology to help me build my rate case, as an example, and get it through the rate case process? So there's a whole set of initial use cases that once we start discussing with the clients, it helps get an idea of what they've done and areas where we can get started. One more thing I'll add is what we also do is we start talking about where this technology is going. This is not about one foundation model, as an example, that you can use for all of your different purposes. Our belief is that you're going to have multiple, more targeted models that are better at certain activities that you're doing. And then we give some examples about things that we're doing with time series data. That's all their SCADA data and their smart meter data. We give examples of a partnership we're doing with NASA around satellite imagery and being able to use that to do things like flooding prediction or land use changes. We talk about what we're doing with a weather perspective. And so what we start to do is broaden the idea to help them understand that it's not just about some of these initial language models. We're at the really, really early stages. There's places where we can start, but we want to build those guardrails so that we can do this more interesting, advanced work with the safety necessary to manage the risk levels.
There's certainly a learning curve out there right across the industry. And as you say, knowledge is relative, right? But you're kind of finding out where it is. But hey, interesting times ahead.
Hey, exciting times. Really looking forward to where we go with this.
Now, one last one. If you're back in this, I'm sure you'll be back at Distributech next year. If you ran the same session, what would you be expecting in 12 months from people in the industry?
So a couple things I fear is some initial early uses of technology like generative AI will be used in an unresponsible way, if that's the right terminology. And so what I worry about is some headlines or some press about some negative impacts of the use of AI. And so that's one of the fears I have. I think on the other side, I think the advancement in what we're going to see, the use cases that we're going to see, the production deployments of models that are bringing real tangible benefits, we're going to see a huge increase in that within the next year. So really looking forward to it. And I'm hoping that as an industry, we really focus on putting those guardrails in place so we don't derail this before we can actually start to take advantage of the technology.
Great point. Hey, good stuff. Till the next time.
Always a pleasure, Kevin.